how does the oligarch or the oligarchy persuade the victims of oligarchy that the people to lead them out of their own problems are the oligarchs?
Well, in that sense, I think, I'm not a historian, there's nothing kind of new about that. If you live in a nation which is struggling economically and people are feeling a lot of pain, I think it's part of human nature to want to understand, why is it happening? And the failure of the Democratic Party has been to not offer an explanation. So we're the richest country on earth, exploding technology. Oh, you're worse off than you were before, and your kids are going to be even worse off than you. And we don't know why. We have no explanation at all. All right? And by the way, we're going to maintain the status quo. Trump has an explanation. And like all demagogues, what he does is go after the weak and the powerless. So in Germany in the 30s, it was the Jews who caused all of the problems. In Cambodia, they had, whoever it was, Rwanda was there. And this is what authoritarian types do. They find a victim. In the United States now, it's no longer gays, by the way. As I mentioned, it's not fashionable to, 20 years ago, the gays were a subject of a lot of attack. It's no longer fashionable, by and large, to be attacking blacks. That was also 30 or 40 years ago, people would run for office. Those black people want your job, white guys. Not fashionable right now. Not all that fashionable to go after women. But it is fashionable to go after the undocumented. So what Trump, his main source of enemy, the main explanation to working people is, we have millions, it's an invasion, and millions of these undocumented people are causing massive amounts of crime. They are taking your jobs, they're taking your housing, and I, Donald Trump, are going to throw out 20 million people. And then, more lately, it is the transgender issue in volleyball, which is one of the great crises facing America right now. So it's going after transgender people, but mostly undocumented people. So what you do is, that is the explanation. And the answer is, we're going to start deporting people all over the place. Vote for me, and that's going to be great.
Because he's doing something, and the more unhappy you are.
You're absolutely right. Now, Joe Biden is a friend of mine, and I've known Joe for many, many years, and I work with him. And under Biden, we passed some of the most progressive legislation in the modern history of this country. But Biden, as president, was a very, very poor communicator and was nowhere near as bold as the times require. All right? People are hurting, and you have to respond to that pain with bold action. And Trump, every day, is bringing about, people want change. I mean, you may laugh about it. You all know in America we have pennies, that's the small. He's now abolished pennies. Now, in the great scheme of things, it doesn't mean much, but people saw change. There used to be pennies. Now there is no more pennies. That's change. All right? All right. And of course, he's doing more than that. He's acting in unconstitutional, illegal ways to bring about really bad change.
You mentioned the Constitution. And you mentioned the Founding Fathers in the 1780s. Did they conceive of a character as venal as Trump?
Well, that's, again, they had fought their revolution, nothing personal here, guys, against the most powerful monarch in the world at that time. And I think they were very conscious of that. I mean, these guys were really smart. And they, I think, wanted to prevent a situation where one person or one entity would have that much power. That is really, in many ways, what the Constitution was about. Now, when the Constitution was written, slavery existed, poor folks couldn't vote, women couldn't vote. So, we don't want to romanticize it. But, they were quite conscious of power and trying to prevent what Trump is now trying to do.
You nailed the oligarchy stuff before the result of the last election came in. So you must have been one of the least surprised people on the planet when Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg and the rest of them lined up in the front row sitting in front of the actual politicians. Have you been taken by surprise subsequently by the speed and the scale of the assault?
Yeah, I have. What they have, again, because when you work with the Biden administration, they say, oh, Bernie, it's a good idea, we can't do it, the lawyers say it's illegal, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. These guys don't stay up nights worrying about what's illegal or not legal, what's constitutional or not constitutional. They go forward. The idea, and to some degree, I don't want to overstate it, it is backfiring. The idea that the richest guy on earth can suddenly come into Washington, D.C., and attempt to dismantle the Social Security Administration, which is life and death to tens of millions of elderly and disabled people, was appalling. They came up with this brilliant idea that they were going to lay off 83,000 employees at the Veterans Administration, which is the medical system which provides, by and large, pretty good health care to our veterans. It's one example of socialized medicine in the United States. The idea that the richest guy would go after the poorest people on earth by trying to end USAID, I think a whole lot of Americans felt really not particularly good about that. And that's kind of, Musk's popularity has descended fairly rapidly.
Is his departure going to change anything?
Pardon me?
Is his departure this week going to change anything, the trajectory?
Well, you know, what will change is when Americans stand up and make it clear that what's going on is not something they will tolerate, and they're going to start voting these Republicans out. You're beginning to see, right now, many Republican members of Congress will not go to a town meeting like this because they know who's going to be in the audience. So the audience is going to say, why are you giving tax breaks to billionaires and cutting Medicaid and nutrition? And they don't have a good answer. But that's not a great place to be politically.
And that's where the authoritarianism kicks in. So they shut down scrutiny and they put themselves increasingly...
Well, that's not, I wouldn't use that as an authority. You know, that's, they understand that you don't want to go into a room where there are a whole lot of people are against you. But what they hope is that the money that comes into their campaigns will be able to get them reelected. I'm not sure that it will. And I think there's a reasonably good chance that Democrats will win the 2026 election in the House.
There's a saying among football fans in this country that we can deal with the despair, Bernie, it's the hope that kills. Your hope is never dimmed, is it?
My hope is what?
Never dimmed.
Never thinned. Well, you know, I'm a lucky guy. It's my wife, Jane, who's here, and I have, you know, when you run for president, you have the opportunity to go all over the country, which, you know, most people don't have, and to meet with literally thousands and thousands of people. So if you were with me on some of the rallies that we did and you look out on, you know, we often do it in rural areas, and you know, 10,000 people out, and they're black, and they're white, and they're Latino, and they're young, and they're very, very diverse, and you can sense that they want to create a very different America, an America, you know, that's based on economic justice, racial justice, social justice, environmental justice. When you see that, and you touch it, and you feel it, it leaves you inspired.
How do we stop that generation falling into the same cycle of grievance and blame that perhaps their parents and grandparents have been seduced into? Because in many ways, the social contract is going to let them down even more severely than the older generation.
You're absolutely right. You know, as I mentioned earlier, what studies suggest is that the younger generation may have a lower standard of living than their parents. The younger generation right now, you know, part of the American dream was that you go out, you work, you get a good job, you work, and when you're young, you're able to own your own home and have, you know, get married, have some kids. That is not the reality for millions of young people right now. It is, and I know this is, when I'm here in London, this is not news to you. It's here, it's all over, we were in Ireland, it's there as well. but very, very hard for a young couple to buy their own home right now. Many young people, if they've gone to college, have left school deeply, deeply in debt, $50,000, $80,000 in debt. They have to pay that off. The jobs they have do not necessarily pay them a lot of money. And, you know, you answer, what's the answer? The answer is to build a political movement, and I think the political movement will, in that movement, young people will play an extremely important role, not only because of economic reasons, but also they, more than their parents and grandparents, understand the reality of climate change. And they do not want to live on a planet which is increasingly uninhabitable.
And that brings us back to the oligarchs, because net zero and fighting climate change is pretty near the top of their to-do list.
You know, it is, you know, and these things are not, and I say this not to be facetious, these are not just economic issues, they are really psychiatric issues. You know, the owners of the fossil fuel industry, they have kids, they have grandchildren, and yet they are willing to sacrifice the well-being of their own progeny in order to make a quick profit by expanding fossil fuel production. It is hard to rationally come to grips with that. But right now, especially under Trump, there's going to be a massive expansion of fossil fuel production. Instead of putting money into health and education and nutrition, those are going to be cut, and we're going to expand if Trump has his way, and we're going to do our best to stop it. Another $150 billion into the military. So we are now spending, if Trump gets what he wants, and I will do my best to stop it, we will be spending over $1 trillion a year on the military, more than the next, I think, 9 or 10 nations combined.
You mentioned psychiatry. Do you dwell on the psychology much? You wrote that we shouldn't hate the oligarchs, we should hate the system that...
Right.
I mean, that's quite a big ask.
Well, you know...
But do we know what drives them? I mean,
yeah,
it's
intrinsic. I wish I could give you a brilliant answer to that, but I think it's the same old bloody answer, and that is wealth and power. You know, these, you would think, rationally, you know, if you had a $5 billion, that might be enough for you, right? You would be comfortable, you could take care of your family for 100 generations. You would not want to cut back on programs for the elderly and the poor and the sick in order to get a tax break, right? I mean, and there are some of these guys who do believe it, who do not feel comfortable about this. But these Musks and this other new brand of oligarchs, they believe, as I mentioned earlier, that they have the right to rule, and they want it all. And they are, in that sense, extremely dangerous people.
What have been the biggest engines of change then to create a world in which the Musks can rise to the very top? Because even under Eisenhower, some of the tax rates for the wealthiest people in the States were as high as 92%. So something epic has shifted.
Well, what has shifted is, you know, using Eisenhower as an example. And Europeans are very familiar with Eisenhower, the leader of the effort in Europe during World War II. And Eisenhower, by the way, is a name never mentioned by the Republicans anymore. You know, they would mention him as often as they'd mention Lenin or Stalin, you know. And Eisenhower was a man from Kansas, kind of an ordinary guy, went to West Point, the military academy, turned out to be a very good military leader. He was kind of a down-to-earth guy, was extremely popular, and yeah, supported the idea of common sense, asking the rich to pay more in taxes. But to answer your question, and this is not just an American issue, globalization and neoliberal type politics has destroyed the lives of many, many, many millions of working class people. If you come to the United States, You will find communities where 40 or 50 years ago, there were factories where workers were in good unions, making decent wages. They went to work. They were proud of the work that they did. They brought home a good paycheck. As often as not, in those days, women could stay home with the kids if that's what they wanted to do. That is not the case anymore. So I would answer your question by again saying that faith in government, when Eisenhower was president, there was pride. All right? We are Americans. This is our government. We believe, they're trying, elected officials are trying their best. They're not perfect, trying their best. That's gone. There is now massive contempt for both major political parties. In fact, depending on the poll you look at, I think more people now see themselves as independents than as Democrats or Republicans.
Because I suppose, staying in the past for a moment, both Roosevelts understood what you described. Theodore and FDR both understood the sort of tyranny of the rich man being a constant threat, but the United States had bulwarks in place. It had walls in place that haven't been pulled down internally necessarily. They've been pulled down globally, leaving the average American feeling dispossessed.
Correct. I mean, we have had trade policies in the United States which have resulted in the hollowing out of communities, the losses of millions of good-paying jobs, thousands of factories.
Can you fix that? Can you reverse that?
I don't know. I mean, my own view is certainly Trump's actions on tariffs are quite crazy. I mean, just totally arbitrary. One day wakes up, well, 50% tariff over there, 80% tariff over there. I don't like your smile, 92% tariff, I mean, really crazy stuff. But, I think countries do have a right. I voted against 2 major trade agreements way back when because it was clear to me that those trade agreements were written by corporate America with the goal of shutting down factories in the United States and moving them to Mexico and then to China. And I remember when I was early in my congressional career, I was in the House of Representatives, I went on a trip, I'll never forget this. Now this is way back, this is early 90s. And I went on a trip to Mexico. And we went to what's called the I'm mispronouncing it, Maquiladora zone, which was established by the Mexican government back then to provide tax breaks for corporate factories. And you go around there and you saw these, this is again back in the early 90s, you saw these beautiful new American factories, European factories, beautiful, state of the art. And then we went out and we talked to the workers, the Mexican workers. Never forget this. Do you know those cardboard boxes that refrigerators come in and ovens come in? That is where they were living. These workers were living in cardboard boxes, dirty water nearby, one electric bulb maybe strung up by some wire, living in utmost poverty, living in these factories. So what that trade agreement was about was to throw American workers out on the street and exploit in a terrible way Mexican workers. So on the other hand, what we know is fair trade, which benefits the workers of both countries, is a positive thing. So I believe in fair trade, but not unfettered free trade.
You mentioned the tariffs and these wonderful trade deals that are imminent any moment now. All of these amazing trade deals that are just around the corner.
But you understand right now, what was true yesterday is not necessarily true tomorrow. And that's one of the things you have to be aware of with Trump. Yeah.
Well, this is my next question. How do you do that? Because that speech there was absolutely loaded with incredibly relevant statistics. The detail was as invigorating as it was enlightening for me, and I'm sure for everybody in the room. But how do you do that personally, Bernie, to know what's wheat and what's chaff when they are throwing so much into the mix?
James, that is exactly one of the issues I stay up nights trying to deal with. And that's part of their strategy. They throw out so much stuff, and you got to respond to this, you got to respond to that, you got to respond to that. And it's imperative that you do respond. I mean, there's one horrible, there was a young Turkish woman In Massachusetts, walking down the street, minding her own business, a van comes along, masked men who happen to be federal agents come out, they grab her, they throw her into a van without any explanation, bring her to some detention center. That is so illegal, so unconstitutional, so unprecedented. That's what happens in dictatorships. That's what happens in Russia. It does not happen in the United States. You got to respond to that. You got to respond to what goes on, the attacks against the universities. But, and here is the big but, to answer your question. If all you do, that's part of their plan. You know, today it is this, tomorrow it's that, da 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 da. What is your plan? How do you really effectively mobilize people to defeat this agenda and this party? And by the way, as I think I indicated in my remarks, you know, the Republican Party has always been a conservative party, but in it you had, you know, independent-minded people who were prepared to stand up. You know, when Richard Nixon was forced to resign, it was a group of Republicans who walked into the White House and said, Mr. President, you can't stay. You got to go. It was a very brave thing for them to do. Right now, there are very, very, very few Republicans who are prepared to stand up to Trump. So we have got to figure out, and it's not easy, and it really is not. We're taking on everybody here. But at the end of the day, it has got to be based on grassroots politics, mobilizing millions and millions of people around an agenda that works for the working class. So we're going to deal with all of his illegal and unconstitutional actions. We'll do the best we can, fight them every single day. But you need, what we say in America is the best defense is a good offense. Yeah. You got to be on the offense. And that means we have got to explain to working class people that we can have a future where we have a vibrant democracy and a government that is addressing their needs, not an autocratic oligarchy.
But in a way, we circle back, don't we? Because even if you can persuade people that their democracy is under existential threat, and I think you think it is at the moment, they're not going to be sufficiently animated by that fear if they don't think democracy is working for them in the first place.
Absolutely. Well, look, I mean, if you are, you know, what we say to people is it's your democratic right to vote every 2 years and every 4 years. And yet it turns out that the candidates they're asked to vote for are supported by the richest people in the country. It turns out that they are probably making, in many cases, less real income than they made, you know, dozens of years ago. They are in desperate situation, and you're asking them to believe that the system works for them. Yeah. Well, you know what? They don't believe it anymore. And that is the danger. And again, it's a danger not only in America. That is what the rise of the right in the UK, in France, in Germany, all over this world is about. And the only way, if the alternative is a right wing which says we're going to smash the whole thing, it's immigration, whatever it is, that's the cause of the problem, we are going to bring about change. And if the old established parties, the center-left parties, say, no, no, you don't understand. The status quo is really working quite well, and you should support us. That ain't going to work. And it blows my mind that whether it's in America or here, these old establishment parties haven't caught on that defending the status quo is not good enough.